Welcome, early American literature friends. This short video is going to guide you through the William Bradford readings. I'm going to try to give you a little bit of background on Bradford and then guide you through the readings. The first thing that I want to point out about the Bradford readings is that they are, if you're trying to read them online, they're in little sections because that is how they are broken into in the textbook. If you have the textbook, it'll be much easier, both because the language is a little updated from Bradford's 1600s language and because the sections are clearly marked. What we are reading begins in the 10th edition on page 144 with from book 2. There's 2 books to Bradford's diaries. There's the first book, which we've always had, and then book 2, which was only recently rediscovered. In the past 100 years, it was recovered. It was lost and then recovered. Book 2 has become the more famous part because it tells about the Mayflower Compact. It gives a bunch more of the famous parts of what we associate. Book 1 has to do with the Pilgrims in Holland, and then their exile in Holland, their conflict with King James I, the King James Bible, King James of England. Book 2 tells much more of their experiences in the New World, in Massachusetts, in Plymouth Colony. You see here Bradford's born in 1590. He is a Puritan, a separatist, what they would have called at the time a Roundhead, based on their particular kind of haircut. It was a political part of their politics. He and the Puritans moved when James I, after the death of Elizabeth I, when James I ascended to the throne in the early 1600s. The Pilgrims left England because of their religious conflicts. They moved to Holland, and then when they came to, my computer has jumped out, give me just 1 second. When they came to, they got a license from both the English government to come to Virginia, actually, but then they were off course. They landed at Plymouth on the Mayflower in 1620. So you're talking over 10 years after Virginia, after John Smith and Jamestown and the Virginia Company. Their base form of government is the Mayflower Compact, which is what we start out with on page 144. The first thing that we are reading is his description of the Mayflower Compact and how they when the boat arrives, but before they get off the boat, before they get off of the boat and take the little rowboats to shore, they set up the Mayflower Compact as this sort of base form of government to run the colony. And then Bradford is not the first governor, but the Puritans have an election for governor every year, and he is intermittently, up until his death in 1657, he serves as governor, sometimes for 2 or 3 years at a time. Sometimes he'll go a year without being governor and do some other stuff, but he is a significant political force in the Plymouth colony. You see right here, he served as governor for about 30 years between 1621 and 1657. So that's not exactly 30 years. He's governor for like 27 years, but it's off and on. Like I said, he'll go for several years as being governor, take a little break, then they'll bring him back. And eventually the Plymouth colony is merged into and sort of swallowed in the late 1600s by the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and Boston emerges as the sort of big city in the area, and it's sort of the government of it swallows up. You see in this excerpt when they talk about conflict with the natives in the Pequot War, they are having these interactions. The Plymouth and the Massachusetts Bay Colony are 2 separate colonies, essentially equals, banding together to send a military force to fight the Pequots, but eventually Plymouth is sort of absorbed into the Massachusetts Bay Colony. What he describes in this section is the 1620s, 1630s, 1640s, when Plymouth is still a dominant force on the same footing as the Massachusetts Bay Colony. If you have the book, again, we're starting on page 144. If you're just reading from the excerpts, this is the excerpt, the remainder of 1620, and then difficult beginnings. And much like John Smith, Bradford and the Puritans have this first really difficult 6 to 9 months, including their first winter, which they refer to as the starving time. Before you get to that, though, I shall return a little back and begin with a combination. By a combination, he means like an agreement. They all combined to make this agreement made by them before they came ashore. Again, they see the shore, but they haven't like disembarked from the ship yet, and so they know they're going to land. They know they've survived the trip. Being the first foundation of their government in this place. This becomes the Mayflower Compact. It becomes this important historical document. And it's really just a paragraph long. You can see it on page 144 or in the excerpt in the of Plymouth Plantation excerpt that begins with "In the name of God, Amen." And you can see they're still using ye, the thorn letter, which that would be pronounced. That's not ye. They would pronounce it as thee. That's just a letter we don't have anymore. But he gives you this description of the Mayflower Compact, and then the first governor is this man named John Carver, which he describes at the beginning of 144. They elect John Carver after they had provided a place for their goods or common store. This would have been an important feature, and Smith talks about this a little too. It's a little more important to the Pilgrims and the Puritans. They kept all their food in a common storehouse. It was doled out by somebody who was in charge. This is also how they would survive, especially early winter. They would go through this time period where they would have the harvest, they would have plenty of food, and then later in the winter, they would have to pull from the common store after the harvest ran out, the things they had set aside, the things they had salted, stuff like that. So they get to shore. After they provided a place for their goods and begun some small cottages, just like Smith, they start building houses. As time would admit, they met and consulted laws and orders, both their civil and military government. So they are a little bit more organized than Smith, but that's because they all want to be there because they have this belief. The colonists in Virginia are there for money. They're there as representatives of the Virginia Company trying to set up a business and make money with the tobacco and later cotton. The Pilgrims have this belief that this is their destiny. They're going to create a new godly settlement, and so they have a little. There's less sort of mutiny and hey, let's go back, because they don't really have any. They can't go back to England. They would just be going back to Holland, where they were already sort of refugees in exile already. And then at the top of page 145, in the difficult beginnings section, if you're reading online, this is the difficult beginnings. In these hard and difficult beginnings, they found some discontents, mutinous speeches, and carriages. But the people that he talked about being mutinous are people who have come over as like indentured servants, and who are on some kind of 3, 5, 7 year work plan. He says that the Pilgrims, the true Puritans, aren't having these problems. But that which was most sad, and this is one of the more famous sections, in 2 or 3 months' time, half their company died. And for them, this would be 40 or 50 people. Half of them died, especially in January, February. Again, that late winter rough section. Being the depth of winter, wanting houses and other comforts, being infected with scurvy. Scurvy, if you don't know, is a deficiency of vitamin C, really common on these Atlantic trips that took months. So as there died, sometimes 2 or 3 a day, out of 100 and odd persons, scarce 50 remain. And of these, in times of most distress, there was but 6 or 7 sound persons who, to their great commendation, spared no pains night or day, but with abundance of toil and hazards, fetched them wood, made them fires, dressed them meat, made their beds, washed their loathsome clothes, clothed and unclothed them. So what he is describing is there are times in this late winter, January, February, early March time period, especially in New England and Massachusetts, if you've ever lived through a Massachusetts winter, roughly half of them die, and then there are periods where only 6 or 7 people are well enough to like get up and help everybody else. But Bradford argues that this is a sign of their sort of unity and faith, that those people help everybody else. They don't just abandon them and be like, oh, you're sick, you just lay there and die. They feed, they clothe, they change these people's dirty clothes. In a word, did all the homely and necessary offices. 2 of these 7 were Mr. William Brewster, the Reverend Elder, who's like the sort of church leader, and Miles Standish, who for the Pilgrims, this is the Pilgrims' John Smith, their sort of military and defense leader. And in fact, John Smith had offered to be the military leader for the Pilgrims, and they took his book and gave it to Miles Standish and said, no, you're a little bit, Smith already had this reputation of being hard to get along with. They said, here's somebody we think we can get along with better, so we'll just take your book and your information and pick this other person who we think is easier to get along with. But I may, and then you jump down to that next paragraph. I may not here pass by another remarkable passage, as this calamity fell among the passengers that were to be left here to plant, and they're hastened ashore and made to drink water. The seamen might have more beer. And so what he is saying is the colonists get sick first, and the sailors who are on the ship, who are unloading the ship, getting the ship ready to sail back to England, they don't get sick like the colonists get sick. At least not immediately, because part of Bradford's point is the colonists get sick first and they take care of each other. And then the disease began to fall amongst them also, the sailors on the ship who were just getting ready to sail back to England. So it's almost half of their company died before they went away. And so it kills half of the sailors too eventually. They don't get sick as quickly. They don't get sick first. The colonists get sick first. But then the sailors get sick too. And Bradford's point here is that the Puritans take care of each other, but when the sailors get sick, they don't take care of each other. They have to sort of bribe each other. This section ends with this description that one of the sailors is sort of on his deathbed, laying there dying. He promises everything he has, all of his property on the ship, to another guy to help him. And the other guy helps him with the expectation that he's going to get this guy's belonging. And then it looks like the guy's going to get better. And the guy who helped him is mad because he's like, oh, he's trying to cheat me out of what he promised me. I thought he was going to die. The guy does eventually die. Another like cursing his wife, saying if it had not been for her, he had never come on this unlucky voyage. So he's like, I wouldn't even be here laying here dying if my wife didn't need the money. My wife didn't tell me to do this. And there's also a person who Bradford says gave the Puritans a hard time, made fun of them as these sort of religious zealots. But then when he got sick, he says, oh, I see how y'all all stick together, and we just sort of stab each other in the back, and it's every man for himself. When he grew weak, they had compassion on him and helped him. Then he confessed he did not deserve it at their hands. So the Puritans, the colonists, help him, and he's like, I don't deserve this. I was mean to y'all. The next section is the dealing with the natives section, which begins on page 146 in the book. Same thing as happens with John Smith. They then begin to try to both establish some sort of peaceable relations for the security of the colony, but also try to set up trade and interactions with the Native Americans. And this is what leads to the first Thanksgiving eventually. They survive that first winter. They're able to plant. They get the Thanksgiving tradition comes from the first harvest, in the first harvest of the Puritans, which is in the fall of 1621. But before you get to that, all this while the Indians came skulking about them. And one of the things that Bradford is especially hard, and clearly also what we would call racist against the Native Americans. He sees them as both heathens and savages, as this sort of lesser form of human beings, who there is some suggestion that he thinks it's not possible to convert these people to Christianity. That said, what he describes in that dealing with the native sections is they talk about how they have these sort of tensions with the Native Americans. The Native Americans steal some of the colonists' tools at one point. But then a Native American comes about the 16th of May, so they've survived that they're at the end of that rough winter. A certain Indian came boldly among them, spoke to them in broken English. And this person's name was Samoset. This is a Native American who has interacted with other explorers and colonists and learned some English. But the person who is really important is this person who Samoset brings to them, who is another Native American whose name was Squanto, a native of this place, who had been in England and could speak better English than himself, Samoset. Being after some time entertained in gifts, they brought again all the tools, and so Squanto organizes the situation, brings back all the tools that were stolen. There is this sort of peacemaking process. About 4 or 5 days after, came with the chief with the aforesaid Squanto. They made peace with him. That's at the bottom of page 146. They make this agreement. He gives you this list of 6 laws that they agree to follow. Squanto continued with them and was their interpreter and was a special instrument sent of God. Again, because Bradford and the Puritans believe they're on this sort of mission from God, they see the appearance of Squanto as this sort of blessing from God. He directed them how to set their corn, where to take fish, so he's shown them how to plant, how to fish, and to procure other commodities, and never left them till he died. And so Squanto becomes this sort of intermediary and assistant, and he essentially joins the Plymouth colony. He was a native, and then you get his history and his sort of sad and unfortunate history of how he came to speak English. He was a native. He was carried away with diverse others by one Hunt, a master of a ship. And you find out that Squanto was essentially kidnapped, had been kidnapped a few years earlier, and that's how he got to England, is that he was kidnapped. The suggestion is there's no clarity about this. There's some suggestion that he might have been taken as a slave and sold as a servant when he got to England, that he might have been taken as like an oddity, as part of like a carnival or a circus, as an oddity, as this sort of evidence of the New World. He was entertained by a merchant in London, employed to Newfoundland. If you know where Newfoundland is, it is on the it is north of Maine in Canada on the eastern coast. Lastly, brought hither into these parts by Mr. Dermer, and so Squanto gets back to North America by getting hired as a servant on a ship, but that gets him back to Newfoundland on the coast of Canada, and then he takes another job working on a ship, which is trading down the coast, and that is how he ends up back in Massachusetts. A gentleman employed by Sir Ferdinando Gorges. Again, these you're dealing in the area, although this is a British colony, you're in that border of the Spanish and French also exploring, and so they're all moving up and down the coast here. And then Bradford gives you the whole rest of this chapter. He describes the history of this man named Mr. Dermer, who is the person who brought Squanto down from Newfoundland to Massachusetts. And he talks about how Dermer has these tensions and conflicts with the Native Americans, and is finally eventually killed by the Native Americans in the somewhere in the Virginia colony. This Mr. Dermer was here the same year that these people came, as appears by relation and given to me by a friend, bearing a date of June 30th, 1620. So Bradford's point is Dermer had brought Squanto down there just a few months before the Pilgrims arrived. And then he tells you this story about, and this is on page 148 if you have the book 148 and then over into 149. He gives you this long description of Dermer having these conflicts up and down the coast with different Native American tribes. He essentially escapes being scalped at one point by paddling away in the canoe down the coast. He is finally then taken prisoner in Virginia and killed. Bradford, at the bottom of 148, at the end of this section, tells you his whole point in telling you the Dermer story, aside from that's how Squanto got here, is his point is, see, these people are dangerous, you can't trust them, the Native Americans. And the suggestion is, like, it's always this sort of tense peace with them, because you never know what might happen. You might make one wrong move, or there might be some accident or incident, and it sets off this like chain where then the Pilgrims are attacked and wiped out. Because again, there's only 40 or 50 of them. They're clearly outnumbered at this point. They don't have the military strength to take on a whole tribe. Their existence is pretty fragile, especially in this first year. And so his point here is, but to return, the spring now approaching, it pleased God, the mortality began to cease amongst them, the sick and lame recovered apace. Again, just like Smith, they survived this first really rough winter. Spring comes, the hunting and fishing gets better again. People aren't dying, 2 and 3 a day, and they have come through what they call the starving time, and things get better. And at the bottom of 149, you get that description, the famous description of the first Thanksgiving. They began now to gather in the small harvest they had to fit up their houses and dwellings against winter. Others were exercised in fishing, about cod and bass, other fish. All the summer there was no want. And then at the end, besides, they had a peck of meal a week, and now since harvest, Indian corn. If you don't know what Indian corn is, it is the kind of corn that has multiple. It's not just plain yellow corn. It has several different colors in it. That's what's called to India. That's what he's talking about, Indian corn. But the first Thanksgiving is such a big deal for them because it suggests that they're going to be able to survive and continue and thrive, because now they've gone through a planting and a growing and a harvest season, and that they can survive that cycle of survive the winter, plant, grow, harvest, and then set aside a store, and nobody goes hungry the next winter. And so they've made it. There is some precedent now for them surviving. That you jump ahead, if you're in the book, you jump ahead from the bottom of page 149 to war threats, which is on page 156. And it's jumping you ahead from 1620 and 1621 to 1636. So we're like 15 years later. Plymouth is now a thriving colony, and thriving so much so that they're growing and developing, and they've started having tensions with the local tribes. And what he describes here is what historians would call the Pequot War. The Pequot War is it really only lasts a year, maybe 18 months, because the Pequots are wiped out, which is what Bradford essentially describes here is the beginning of the end for the Pequots. In the year 1634, the Pequots, a stout and warlike people who had made wars with sundry of their neighbors, other tribes, including this other tribe that he describes here, the Narragansetts. And what happens is the Pequots want to ally with the Narragansetts, and the Narragansetts, who have been having wars with the Pequots, say the Pequots want to ally with the Narragansetts and try to make potentially the suggestion of Bradford here is wipe out the Plymouth colony. The Narragansetts decide instead to ally with the English and make war against the Pequots. And most of what you get described here at the bottom of 157, 158, and then 159 is what is now historically known as the Mystic Massacre. And you can see right here, here's the Plymouth colony, Cape Cod Bay. You see Boston up here. This is where the Massachusetts Bay Colony is found, and it eventually sort of swallows up this whole area. You see the island of Martha's Vineyard, Plymouth Rock, and then the big bay here. The Mystic Massacre occurs not in Massachusetts, but over here in Connecticut. This is the Mystic River right here. So they gather the Connecticut colony, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and then the Plymouth. They all ally their military leaders together with some of the Narragansetts. They all march down here, and what they do is attack depending on how you read it, either just a town, because clearly at least half of the people they kill are women and children, or they would argue they attack the strongest fort of the Pequots. They kill somewhere between 400 and 600 Native Americans in this attack, and that is described on one. In the forepart of this year, 1637, the Pequots fell openly upon the English at Connecticut. That is, they attacked the English over in Connecticut. The Connecticut colony asked for aid. And they all get all the colonists, this multiple group of colonists, like I said, from Connecticut, Plymouth, and Massachusetts Bay ally, and they ally with the Narragansetts. And then you get that description, and it's on page 159 in the book, where the Narragansetts form the fort is a circle, the village is a circle. The Narragansetts get in a line and make a circle around it, and then the English just charge in, start shooting people. They set the houses on fire so that some people are burned alive. There's this very intense description. It was thus conceived, they thus destroyed about 400 at this time. It was a fearful sight. This is right in the middle of 159 if you have the book. It's a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fire, streams of blood quenching the same. So this is a pretty graphic, intense description. Like houses are on fire and there's so much blood just flowing through the streets that it's putting out the fires. The Narragansett Indians all this while stood around, but aloof from all danger, and left the whole execution to the English. Again, the Narragansetts just had this perimeter so that in case any of the Pequots escape, they capture them, or kill them. And the streams of blood quenching the same, and horrible was the stink and scent thereof. Obviously, people getting burned alive, and it smells awful. And the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and they gave the praise thereof to God. One of the sort of ironies of Bradford and the sort of Puritan belief that like they're on this mission from God is here they are wiping out this village, and they're like, oh, praise God for this wonderful victory that we were able to kill, 400 or 500, 600 people, at least half of them women and children. But he's like, God, it's just what God wanted. God gave us this victory. There's this description, the rest of that section on page 159. And then at the top of page 160, he says, after they wipe out this village, the Pequots are essentially wiped out as like a threat, as a military force. Some of them join the Narragansett tribe. Some of them join the Mohegan and the Mohawk tribes. And Bradford says, that I may make an end of this matter, the Sassacus, who is the Pequot's chief, fled to the Mohawks, and they cut off his head. So the chief of the Pequots is killed. But thus the war took end. The rest of the Pequots were wholly driven from their place, and some of them submitted themselves to Narragansetts and lived under them. Other than betook themselves to the Mohicans under Uncas, their sachem. That's the Native American word for tribal leader. And so the suggestion here is this is an important section in this book, both because it shows the dangers of the Native Americans, and particularly the Pequots, who in this case were the ones who were obviously, making the most trouble, but also Plymouth has grown, the colonists have grown and strengthened themselves so much that now they're capable of like joining their forces and wiping out a whole tribe of people. They've clearly taken hold and are not living day to day and just surviving. But by you get to the 1630s to mid 1630s, 15 years in, and they're clearly ready to do some intense violence, like wipe out a whole village and those kinds of things. The next section that is on 160 and 161 is what is often referred to as the horrible truth section. This is about the execution of a teenager who was about 16 or 17 years old. His name was Thomas Granger. You see, there was a youth whose name was Thomas Granger, servant to an honest man of Duxbury, about 16 or 17 years old. And this is one of Bradford's. Bradford really sticks on this point because he says Granger is not a Puritan. He is an indentured servant who is a servant to a Puritan. He is not one of us. Bradford really wants to point out to you, and he comes back to that later in this section. He was this year detected of buggery and indicted for the same with a mare, a cow, 2 goats, 5 sheep, 2 calves, and a turkey. If you don't understand what's happening here, Granger is having sexual relations with various livestock here, including a female horse, cows, 2 calves, a turkey. He was first discovered by one that accidentally saw his lewd practice towards the mare. I forbear particulars. That's always a funny part of this because he tells you how Granger was caught. Somebody saw him having sex with the horse, but then he says, I forbear particulars. Like, I'm not going to get into the details because this is obviously, problematic. What they do, though, is they apply Levitical law. And if you know Leviticus and Levitical law, this is a reference to the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Old Testament. And it has to do with like Orthodox Jewish people not eating pork, and they're all of this like unclean animals and stuff like that. And what they decide they have to do is kill Granger. And Thomas Granger exists historically as this anomaly because he's the only person ever killed in the British colonies or in the United States for bestiality, for buggery with animals. And so what they do is they force him to identify all the animals that he has defiled. They kill all the animals because they read them now as unclean in this sort of orthodoxy way. And then they execute Granger. Some of the sheep could not so well be known by his description. Others with them were brought before him, and he declared which were they and which were not. There's this somewhat gross but also somewhat funny scene where they bring all these sheep in and are like, all right, tell us which ones. A very sad spectacle it was. For first the mare, then the cow, and the rest of the lesser cattle, he's using cattle as like the word for livestock, were killed before his face, according to the law, Leviticus 20, verse 15. And then he himself was executed. The cattle were all cast into a great and large pit, digged for the purpose, and no use made of any part of them. Again, that sort of Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, Levitical law applied here. Again, you have to understand that the Puritans, there is no separation of church and state. Levitical laws, when they have some issue like this to decide or deal with, they're just like, well, this is what they did in Leviticus. Let's just stick with that. But the rest of this section is also really interesting. The rest of the horrible truth is they've dealt with Granger, but then Bradford feels this need to explain like how something like this could happen in Plymouth colony, which is supposedly made up of the Puritans. And he says, upon the examination of this person and a former that had made some sodomitical attempts upon them, the one confessed he had long used it in Old England. And so the suggestion there is like he brought this bad habit with him when he came over. But it may be demanded how it came to pass that so many wicked persons and profane people should so quickly come over into this land, seeing it was religious men that began the work. He's trying to address this, like, he's trying to respond to this argument of, if y'all are so holy and so Christian and so, so straightforward and good, how are things like this awful thing happening with Granger? I confess this may be marveled at, but I'm going to endeavor to give some answer. At first, according to that, it is ever to be remembered that where the Lord begins to sow good seed, the envious man will endeavor to sow tares. And so he's saying, like, the Plymouth colony is succeeding, and so other people want to come, and many of those people that want to come are not as religious and straightforward as the Puritans. Secondly, men being come over into a wilderness in which much labor and service was to be done, such as wanted help in that respect, when they could not have such as they would, were glad to take such as they could. The men in the Plymouth colony, there were not many women in the Plymouth colony. The men outnumbered the women 8-1, 9-1, 10-1. Bradford is trying to very, very delicately make this point that there was clearly not enough women for the men, and so Bradford's argument is the men, had these desires and they acted on them, and they couldn't have what they wanted, women, and so they just acted on them however they could. He's trying to be delicate about this, but he's obviously talking about there's a shortage of women, and this is how they responded. And then he says, thirdly, the men, finding so many godly disposed persons willing to come to these parts, began to make a trade of it to transport passengers and goods, and they cared not who the persons were, so they had money to pay them. And by this means the country became pestered with many unworthy persons. What he is saying here is the ships that come are bringing Puritans, and there's more and more Puritans coming, sure, but to fill out the extra space in the ships want to make as much money as they can when they come across the Atlantic, and so they'll just take anybody. And so what he's saying is the colony is succeeding, and many people who are not Puritans are coming into this country, and that is causing this sort of increase of this bad, what he calls this bad and profane behavior. And so he's saying as much as the Puritans are growing and thriving, all these other people are flooding into the colony too, and it's them causing these problems and troubles. And that is his sort of what he does. He explains what happens with Granger, and he's like, this is part of the historical record, so I'll explain what happened. But then he turns it and takes it into this explanation about how, sure, the colony, the good of the colony is doing good and growing and thriving, but it's also having these issues because of that growth and success and thriving. These people who are not Puritans are coming in and bringing in their what he would call their wickedness. That's the last reading section here. There's some other descriptions. If you look at the book, there is this last description of the Plymouth colony becomes a victim of its own success. They grow so much that there's not enough land for all the Puritans, and so the church has to split into the North Bay and the South Bay. That is sort of the beginning of the end of the Plymouth colony once the church splits into the original church splits into two churches. And then that first generation of Puritans who landed there in 1620, they're all gone. So people aren't sort of unified as they were. And that is the beginning of the end. And that leads to the Plymouth colony eventually being absorbed by the Massachusetts Bay Colony in Boston, and then the forerunner of the state of Massachusetts. Bradford is important because he gives us the history of the second lasting settlement in this country, and perhaps as famous or more famous than Jamestown, because it is where we get the Thanksgiving tradition. Bradford both tells you this sort of straightforward history, although obviously he has the slant of believing they're on this mission from God, and so you have to read this through the lens of his perspective, that they succeed because it's God's will and the sort of divine desire to save and preserve them in the wilderness. But Bradford also has an important role because, like I said, he is governor off and on for 30 years, 1620, 1630, 1640. And so I hope that helps you understand Bradford in this short section. I skipped over the other famous part of Bradford's journal is the trip over and the sort of surviving on the ship and their hardships on the ship. But what is often most interesting to people is the landing in Plymouth Rock. If you've ever been to Plymouth and seen Plymouth Rock, the original Plymouth Rock was not that big, and the Plymouth Rock that is there now is very small. And it is because there was this tradition for over 100 years of people would come, and locals and tourists, and chip a little piece of it off and take it home. And it got pieces of Plymouth Rock, so much of Plymouth Rock got chipped off that they finally had to stop people from doing that and save the little bit that they have left. If you go to the Puritan, the Pilgrim Museum there, you can see Plymouth Rock and Plymouth Shore. It's not a very big bay. And you can see right here, it's at the top of this big enclosed Cape Cod Bay, the north end of it. But hopefully that helps you understand Bradford. Again, Bradford and Smith are our two examples of colonialism. The Virginia colony in Jamestown is there for the economic gain. The Puritans, the Pilgrims, are different because they're there for religious conversion and refuge from religious persecution in Europe. The Bradford response, let's see. The Bradford response, if you're interested in the Bradford response, define and explain the threats that Bradford describes to the Puritan vision of settlement in New England. There's several threats to that, like Granger, and Granger is a threat because it is all these unworthy people coming in and sort of spoiling and poisoning the Puritans' purity and their desire to have this pure city on a hill settlement. Is there one threat that he views as most prominent or most problematic? You also got the threat of the Native Americans, which is what leads them to wipe out the Pequot War and to wiping out the Pequots. So think about what you think in your reading of this he views as the biggest threat. Is it these external threats like the Native Americans? Is it this other kind of threat from the English themselves, the non-Puritan settlers who are coming in and colonizing? Is it the Puritans themselves because like they're having so much success that they're growing and spreading? If not, explain and explore the ways that he responds to different threats, like whether it's Granger or whether it's the Native Americans, whether it's like illness and the sort of surviving that first hard winter. Think about the different threats to their survival and success that he describes in the sections that we've read, and explore and explain those threats, especially if you think one of them is bigger or more significant than the rest. I hope that helps you understand Bradford, and write this response if you want to. This response is due the following Monday, June 12th, if you want to write it. If you have questions about any of that, please don't hesitate to be in touch with me. I hope, again, this is useful to you, and I hope you're having a good